With that, it's my pleasure to introduce JHS Board Member and Program Chair, Dr. David Jameson of Edward Waters University, and he will welcome our speakers. Dr. Jameson.
Thank you, William. Welcome, everyone. So excited to be here, so excited to be in this part of town, the urban core. I just want to remind everyone, the Jacksonville Historical Society is for all of us, but we have to become members. So we want to make this inclusive. We want to make sure that all of our stories are represented. So please, please join. Please join. Judge Brian Davis is currently serving as a United States District Court Judge, Middle District of Florida. At age 68, he was appointed by President Barack Obama on December 26, 2013. Judge Davis, previously a state circuit court judge, served on the civil, family, juvenile, and probate benches in the historic courthouse on Amelia Island. He also previously served on the family, juvenile, and civil benches in his hometown of Jacksonville. He's been a judge for 26 years. He earned a bachelor's from Princeton University in 1974, and in 1980, a Juris Doctorate from the University of Florida. He's actively volunteered with Leadership Jacksonville, NCCJ, Urban League, the NAACP, Omega Psi Phi Fraternity, Jacksonville Community Council, Hubbard House, Help Center, Pay Center for Girls, One Jax, and the Jaguars Foundation. He's chaired the Mayor's 1999 Domestic Violence Task Force, causing significant changes in the treatment of domestic violence victims in cases in Duval County. He's an active supporter of urban scouting, which brings scouting to children without costs. In 2002, Judge Davis co-chaired JCCI's Beyond the Talk, Improving Race Relations study, resulting in an annual race relations progress report for Jacksonville. And in 2009, he co-chaired Project Breakthrough, a community leadership initiative against racism. In 2008, Judge Davis helped establish Nassau County's mental health court, then only one of 10 in Florida, where he presided over a docket designed to prevent the mentally ill from being incarcerated. He currently serves as a Community Foundation trustee and as a board member of the Jacksonville Public Education Fund, and is an executive board member of the North Florida Council of Boy Scouts of America. And most importantly, in September 2021, Judge Davis celebrated 45 years of marriage to Tanya, with whom he worships at Ebenezer United Methodist Church. He's a grandfather to 5 offspring of 2 children, Brian and Cicely. Please welcome the Honorable Brian Jordan Davis.
Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. I do that in court if the lawyers don't respond until I say hello. I am so happy to be here tonight for so many reasons, and there are a few. First, let me thank Dr. Jameson and Alan for their introduction, and the Jacksonville Historical Society for sponsoring this event. I hope one of the points we'll make tonight is just how important history is, not only its preservation, but its sharing. And I know that's the mission of the Jacksonville Historical Society. So I hope to inspire. Actually, I wanted to comment on the publicity given this event. I noticed that it used the word inspired and kind of focused on me and Joseph E. Lee. As you'll learn as the evening goes, that isn't really the purpose that I envision, and I'll share some of, it'll become obvious what my purpose was in agreeing to do this tonight. But let me share some of the interesting reasons I think that we are here tonight. Go with me, if you will, back to 1963. There's some of you who can't do that because you're a little bit too young. But at that time, I was 10 years old. And in the city of Jacksonville, my hometown, as it was mentioned, The city recreation department was segregated. There were parks for black children and parks for white children, and the two did not meet. And in connection with the African American parks in the city, annually, there would be a celebration in which children from all over the parks, and to Jacksonville's credit at the time, it had an extensive recreational system and parks that were actively used by children and parents in the community. But at least once a year, the children from the African American parks and their parents would convene at Durkee Park, Durkee Field on the corner of Myrtle and 8th. Still there. The field has been named after one of Stanton's renowned coaches, James Bublin Small, and it was at that park that little black children from all over the city would come to play at a play day. I remember poker sack races, is that what they call them? Yeah. I think I won something called a crab race, where you get down on all four. And so it wasn't, it wasn't fancy sports. It was just a good play day. And the name of the play day was Joseph Lee Day. And I suspect many of the children that were there knew who Joseph Lee was. We were just happy to be there playing that day. And as I grew and became a lawyer, I ran across Joseph Lee. His name appeared. I said, I wonder if that's the same man who this day was celebrated for in the African American community by black children at the supervision of black adults. And I took from that experience some pride. And it wasn't the first time that I had this pride that was based in the fact that there were African American adults who were consciously and intentionally preserving history. I ran across it earlier in Jacksonville as a member of the totally segregated Boy Scouts of America system that was in place. And if you haven't been to this museum, I encourage you, implore you, probably can't do it tonight, it's going to be a little too late, but come back and tour the museum. There's a gentleman there, David Dwight. He was the first African American in the nation to receive the Silver Beaver Award, which is one of scouting's highest awards. Well, in the 1930s, he established here in Jacksonville an active Boy Scout program that lasted 30 years. I was part of it. There was a camp here, segregated camp for African children, boys, called Camp Coacoochee. People always laugh at the name. But Coacoochee, also known as Wildcat, was an African American and Seminole of mixed heritage that during the Second Seminole War fought against probably our city's namesake. And but the fact that then there were people thinking about that history in a way to associate it with African American children, African American heroes, or people who they were preserving the history. And so I digress, but my point is that the history is important and it needs to be shared in as many and as interesting ways as it can, and this is one of them. It's one of the reasons that that interest that I developed in Joseph E. Lee led me to Edward Waters College. And I'm talking in the present tense. I'm looking to research his life and learn that he had a connection with that college. And I decided, well, let me reach out to the school and some of its students to see if they want to help in the research. And sure enough, as is evidenced tonight in living color, the response was positive. Students in their criminal justice program said, sure, Judge, we will do that, and they are going to help me present Joseph E. Lee to you tonight. The first, all the way to the end, is L.E. Anderson, also known as Sharon. He is from, Sean, you're in Houston?
Lubbock, Texas.
Lubbock, Texas. He's a graduate of EWC, recently an honors graduate in criminal justice. He has been accepted to some law schools, plural, recently, and is about to. And it's not at law school yet, but he helped establish the pre-law program at EWU now, and was a member of the Sheriff Shadco organization trying to ensure safety in and around the neighborhood, and also a member of the National Bar Association. Next to him is, got led to because of my interest, another EWU student, Ethan Aramis Theodore. And I wish you all could have been with me last night, because he presented to about 400 people, lawyers from around the state, from around the city. There are ends of court based on the English system of legal delivery, services delivery, the court system in England, here in Jacksonville. And there are probably about 6 or 7 of them, all with 50 members or more. But it's a kind of perceived to be a prestigious collection of lawyers, and the membership is somewhat limited for some reason. But anyway, Ethan was there last night presenting Joseph E. Lee to that group, and he did an absolutely wonderful. He is also applying to law school and will be currently working with a law firm as an administrative clerk. He's actively involved in the political system as a progressive caucus leader. They, of course, had, and there were some other students who aren't here with us tonight, but they were all being taught by our next panelist, who I was led to at EWU, who is, and I have to write her name down phonetically, it's A.K. Early. She is a lawyer. Did I say it right? Good, good. She is a lawyer who is also a professor at EWU, and a member of at least 3 a couple of courts, the Middle District Court, all the courts in Duval County. She is in private practice additionally, and I came to learn, educated at Golden Gate University in San Francisco, California, on that coast, and then across the pond at the University of London, in London, England. So I'm pleased to have her join us. They also led me to our next panelist, who is not a stranger to the Jacksonville Historical Society, Dr. Jerry Urso. Dr. Urso is a 3rd-generation Mason, and as you learn about Joseph E. Lee tonight, you will get an appreciation of why his affiliation as a Mason is important. But he's from Worcester, Massachusetts, originally. We share the distinction and honor of being Eagle Scouts, and I didn't know that until I saw your resume, Jerry. And he's also a doctor of theology. His resume, as far as the Masonic organization, was so interesting to me because I'm not a member of the organization. I know its importance and depth and some of its history, but these are some of the titles he holds. Master of Shining, he's a charter member, he's an excellent high priest, he's a grand inspector, a grand trustee, a fellow of the Phylexis Society, and most importantly for our purposes tonight, Grand Historian of the Most Worshipful Union Grand Lodge. He's a published author, and as I said, a member of the Jacksonville Historical Society. So thank you, Doctor, for being here. I need to try to hurry. You know, you all don't know how dangerous it is to give a judge who is also a lawyer. Judges do a lot of listening, but the lawyer in you wants to talk. And I won't stop if you all don't make me, so I'll try not to keep you here all night. I'm going to rush through what I hope will be a context for the life of Joseph E. Lee that we'll present. And it's divided basically into 3 periods of his life. The first from up to his age of 24, which would have been from 1849 to 1873. That's a 24-year period. The middle will be from 1873 to 1903. That's a 30-year period, ages 24 to 54. And then a later life period, a 17-year period from 1903 to 1920. I'm going to introduce each of those periods with just a context, if you will, of the world, not so much the world, the nation, and Jacksonville, very quickly, and then we'll hear from our panelists. Joseph E. Lee lived through 16 presidents of the United States. When he was 12 years old, he is reported to have taken a glimpse from a light post of Abraham Lincoln. I want you to kind of think about this in this kind of world, in this context. By the time he was 20 years old, Ulysses Grant was the president. Nationally, he was born a year or so after the California Gold Rush. Uncle Tom's Cabin was published when he was 3 years old. Dred Scott decision. You all, I presume, are familiar with it and its horror and era in our history. Was issued when he was an 8-year-old boy. Lincoln declared emancipation when he was age 14. And Ms. O'Leary's cow kicked over the lantern, Chicago burned to the ground when he was 22 years old. Jacksonville, or Florida, I should say, had been a state for about 4 years at the time that he was born. The railroads were beginning to cross the state when he was about 9. The 54th Massachusetts Regiment was housed or camped here in Jacksonville when he was 13 years old. Ferschkes, you all from Jacksonville remember Ferschkes. It was established when Joseph E. Lee was 22 years old. In the African American community specifically, Mother Midway Church, the first African American church in Jacksonville, was established when Joseph E. Lee was 16 years old. EWC was founded when he was 17. The beginning of the election of African American leaders in this community post-Civil War began when he was 18 years old. He was still in D.C., we'll learn, and at age 22, someone asked about James Weldon Johnson and their relative positions. Joseph E. Lee was 22 years old when James Weldon Johnson was born. So that's the first 24 years of his life in context. And with that, I'm going to ask Ethan to talk about his early life.
Thank you, Judge. And thank you to everybody that's here. Thank you to my professors. So let's get into it. So the life and legacy of Joseph Edward Lee, we call him Joseph E. Lee or Judge Lee. He was born September 15th, 1849 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Soon after being born, he was an orphan. He was then placed into a home with the Religious Society of Friends, also known as Quakers. This is very important because this allowed him to have access to better educational programs than he would have normally had as an orphan. At the age of 4 years old, he was enrolled in the James Fordham Grammar School. He was then matriculated into the Institute for Colored Youth, which has very rich history. It is now known as Cheney State University.
Well, I'm going to interrupt here just to add. Is this Michael? Can you all hear me? Do you all have the experience of learning a word, and as soon as you learn it, you then see it, or you hear something, and then you have it repeated? How many of you here watch Netflix? Anybody watching The Gilded Age? the African-American woman in that, I think her name is Miss Scott, she graduated in the Gilded Age on Netflix. They say, and I was surprised, she graduated from the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia, where that institute is actually situated. And I learned from a little research that Philadelphia at the time had a vibrant African-American community of free, then called colored people. So I'm not going to interrupt you again.
And these are the Institute for Colored Youth itself and the students that went to that school. And he was mentored by a very wonderful woman. Her name is Fannie J. Coppin. She's the first black woman principal within the United States. And she lists Joseph E. Lee as one of her proteges and a great force for good within the city of Jacksonville. And there is a historical marker dedicated to Fannie J. Coppin, who was the principal, and how it later became Cheney State University.
Which is still in HBCU, by the way.
Yes.
It's a picture.
That's the picture of how it is then and now. And he graduated from the Institute for Colored Youth in 1869 with high honors. He then worked for a little bit and got enrolled into Howard University. Go ahead, Sean.
Yes. So, he attended Howard University in 1870.
Yeah.
He's good? Yeah. He supported himself through law school with a confidential clerkship in D.C. Here's a couple pictures of Howard students and the Howard University. Here's Joseph E. Lee in the alumni catalog. You can see his name highlighted there. And then here's a current picture of Howard University. As you see there, Howard was chartered in 1867. To give a little bit of background on how the school was then, in 1869 was when the law department was officially founded, and they had a total of 6 students. By the end of the summer, June of 1869, there were 22 students, and these students were all attending night classes in the homes and offices of the faculty. Joseph E. Lee graduated in 73, where he immediately moved to Jacksonville. So picture Jacksonville at the time. He moved to Jacksonville in 1873, and it is believed that he moved to Jacksonville through the influence of William J. Perman and Jonathan Gibbs. William J. Perman and Jonathan Gibbs, they were both born in Pennsylvania, like Joseph E. Lee. They both moved to Jacksonville. They were both heavily involved in politics. Perman was a United States representative. Jonathan Gibbs was the first black Secretary of State, as well as the first black superintendent in Florida. More pictures of Jacksonville.
And these two individuals, this is Josiah T. Walls and Reverend John R. Scott. Josiah T. Walls was the first black congressman to come from the state of Florida. And he represented, I'm not sure which district, but it was the state of Florida. Reverend John R. Scott was a prominent religious leader within the city. He also was the president of Edward Waters College at the time.
I'm going to stop here because this is about the time that the period, 30-year period, the middle portion of Joseph E. Lee's life begins, and I want to provide a little more context for you. Ulysses Grant is the president at the time. A Bell Telephone Company was being established when Joseph E. Lee was 26 years old. Thomas Edison was working on his bulb at age 29. Coca-Cola was established at age 37. And during the period of time of Judge Lee's appointment to, or I should say election to the bench, Grover Cleveland lost to Benjamin Harris in 1888. John Sullivan was the heavyweight champion of the world. Frederick Douglass, and I didn't know this, was nominated as Vice President of the United States in 1888. Washington Monument was being constructed. was getting its start. Ellis Island opened in 1892, and the Wright brothers took flight at age 54 when Joseph E. Lee was 54 years old. Jacksonville, and some of it's going to be depicted later, was during this period of time becoming a winter resort, and it had you all probably know about it, the subtropical exposition. It was like a world's fair. They were trying to get tourists to come to Jacksonville. And I was surprised at how actively involved the African American community was involved in this. Joseph E. Lee was a speaker at the Jacksonville exposition. I think Grover Cleveland actually opened the exposition. Frederick Douglass spoke at the exposition. It was a wonderful event. And it was on the corner of Main and First Street where the waterworks are now. And I have trouble imagining being in that location, but that's where it was. It was destroyed by fire some years later and not replaced. I guess some would argue the Coliseum that we built might have been its replacement. The yellow fever epidemic happened when he was 39 to 40 years old, around that time. And the Great Fire of 1901, of course, would have been during his life as well. So keep that in context with some of the middle of his life. Who's up next year? Dr. Ehrlich is going to take us. Going to take us here. Is that you? John, is that yours?
Well, the reason that that John R. Scott and Josiah T. Walls are important is because these two individuals managed to recruit Joseph E. Lee to be a politician. And in 1875, he was elected to be a Florida House representative, thanks to these individuals. And they also got him elected to the Florida State Senate in 1880. He served 2 terms in the Florida House and 1 in the State Senate.
Abraham Grant?
This is a photo of Abraham Grant. Jerry, would you like to go ahead and take this?
Sure. So Bishop Abraham Grant was probably the most prominent African American in the entire United States nobody ever heard of. And he was a protege of Booker T. Washington. He actually probably dined in the White House before Booker T. Washington. That made a big impact in the newspapers when Booker T. dined with Teddy Roosevelt, but it's almost impossible that Grant didn't dine with President McKinley. He actually toured Arlington Cemetery with President McKinley and rode in the carriage. They didn't have limousines back then, so they had a presidential carriage, and they toured the United States Colored Infantry soldiers at Arlington Cemetery. Bishop Grant was also a Prince Hall Mason, along with John Scott and Josiah T. Walls. Bishop Grant probably founded at least 7 HBCUs and served on the board of trustees for 4 more. He was just amazing. And Edward Waters College wouldn't be where it is if it wasn't for Bishop Abraham Grant. He was the straw that stirred the drink, so to speak, in order to make sure Edward Waters College went from Lincoln Institute in Jacksonville and Brown College in Live Oak, Florida, to bring these 2 entities together to form Edward Waters College. So the first president to serve under the name Edward Waters College would be John Scott, Jr. Now, his dad was extremely important in the life of Joseph E. Lee because he was already a public official. So he was he served the Florida legislature. He actually died in chambers. He was also part of the Prohibition movement in Jacksonville. So La Villa was a very thriving area, but there was a street called Houston Street back then where they had bordellos, opium. So there was a opium epidemic back then. You could get laudanum for a nickel, and that would caused a lot of drug problems and so forth. So Joseph E. Lee, John Scott, a lady by the name of Ada Braddock, who heard the picture right there. They formed an organization called the Good Templar Society, and it was to help newly freed slaves and people to not be parted with their money through drugs, prostitution, gambling, and etc. Because, you know, as soon as people found this newfound wealth with the freedom, there was devices created to separate them from that new wealth that they were inheriting. And Ada and her husband, Pembroke Braddock, were probably two of the most affluent African Americans in La Villa at the time. They actually used their own personal money to start to build the first brick structure for African Americans in the state of Florida when they built St. Paul A.M.E. Church, when it went from a wood structure to a brick structure. It was their personal money. In this next slide, you see Josiah T. Walls again. He was a member of the United States Colored Infantry. First, he was forced to serve in the Confederacy as, and he was hauling like a mule, ammunitions and so forth. But he paid close attention to this. So when his unit was captured by the United States Colored Infantry, the 3rd Infantry, he switched sides. And shortly after, he becomes an artillery instructor for the United States Colored Infantry. He then becomes the first United States congressman from Florida. And if you've ever seen the picture of the first representatives and senators, there's like 7 of them. He's actually prominent in the middle between Hyman Rebels and Robert Smalls. The racism in Jacksonville was so strong that they would go against what was best for the state of Florida and best for the city of Jacksonville. So he actually put forth legislation, the first in the country's history, called the National Education Act of 1872, where there would have been public funds to form schools and so forth, and it was shot down. He then put forth the legislation to have a canal built in the state of Florida that would have went from Daytona all the way to Tampa, which would have made Florida the most wealthiest state in the country. So imagine having an I-4 corridor, right, where there's now Route 4 cuts through the entire state. That would have been a canal for shipping, and Florida would have benefited. But because of such heated racism that existed at that time, anything he tried to put forth in Congress was shot down.
Wow. Want to talk about what?
Yes, sir. And right next to him is J. Douglas Wetmore, who was heavily influenced by Joseph E. Lee. He met Joseph E. Lee when he was a little boy, along with the Johnson brothers, James Weldon and John Roseman. They used to sweep the floor at Joseph E. Lee's office. So the two, James Weldon and J. Douglas Wetmore, actually formed a law firm here in Jacksonville called Wetmore and Johnson. J. Douglas Wetmore is probably the most prominent civil rights attorney nobody's ever heard of. 50 years before Rosa Parks, there was a guy from the city of Jacksonville named Andrew Patterson who got on a trolley after the Great Fire of 1901. An African-American company got the bond to build a trolley that went from La Villa to Panama Park. He was seated, was asked to move because of the new law called Plessy versus Ferguson. So he refused his seat. Now, when no shame to Rosa Parks, but when Andrew Patterson refused to get up, he could have faced lynching. But when he was arrested, there was a mob that went to the jail, and they were going to lynch Andrew Patterson. This started the biggest revolt in this city's history, led by Joseph E. Lee, John Scott Jr., and a Reverend, Reuben Brooks. So they led a boycott that spread through the entire state of Florida, and they shut the transportation system down in Tallahassee, Pensacola, Tampa, and Jacksonville. And J. Douglas Wetmore went before the state Supreme Court and beat Patterson v. Florida, where he desegregated the trolley car system. Only 5 years later, they would come up with new laws called separate or equal, and the new Supreme Court justices, when some of the Republicans had faded out, the new Democratic Party, it took over back then when they flipped.
Let me tell you, I learned an interesting fact about Wetmore's practice generally. He was of mixed race, and when he went to court, and it was in his advantage to be Caucasian, he was Caucasian. When he went to court and it was to his advantage to be African American, he was African American, which was an interesting fact to learn about his practice. He was run out of Jacksonville following some of the the history that Dr. Urso shared with you, and went to New York and had a thriving practice there, but because he lost some of his fortune in the fire, he fell on hard times, and he ended up committing suicide eventually. I'm sorry, Jerry, I just wanted to share that.
So J. Douglas Wetmore had a tragic life because he had to live in this dual world. He was a black man that passed for white, and the very people that, like, which was James Weldon Johnson. He actually wrote a book about him called Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, that was actually about J. Douglas Wetmore. But when James Weldon Johnson wrote the book, he wrote it anonymously. It wasn't until after J. Douglas Wetmore's death that he actually put his name on the book. And there was also another attorney he was associated with called Henry Ballou, was from Jacksonville, also Prince Hall Mason, also...
I'm going to quote Henry Ballou, John Henry Ballou, in a little bit.
So John Henry Ballou is actually the first person to defeat cohabitation law. So y'all know about the movie Loving versus Virginia, right? Well, 100 years before that, John Henry Ballou went to the United States Supreme Court, and in the state of Rhode Island, he abolished the cohabitation laws, and then came in and started a black newspaper on 410 Broad Street.
I just remembered another fact. Pardon me for interrupting. This is interesting about the rail car, but in Jacksonville, it was owned by blacks. And I learned that the owners had made the white people sit in the back.
Yep.
And that part of the controversy in the African American community was, what are you doing? Why are you challenging us? We've got the best seats on the bus. That took I'm sorry.
No. And so next we have one of the really most forgotten people in Jacksonville history is William Middleton Artrell. So William Middleton Artrell was a Bahamian educator who, when he moved to Key West, Florida, started one of the first black schools in the state of Florida when he started the Frederick Douglass School. So he moves to Jacksonville, and during the yellow fever epidemic, he was actually the director of public health in Jacksonville. He worked with Dr. Alexander Dons. If you ever have a chance when you go to City Cemetery, please visit Dr. Alexander Dons too. I mean, he saved thousands. The mayor of Jacksonville fled and went to Savannah. A lot of the white doctors fled, and there was only a few doctors left. An African American named Dr. Alexander Dons saved over 5,000 people's lives. When he died, and they had the funeral at Mother Midway Church, it was the largest funeral in Jacksonville history at that time, and it was white people as well as black people filled the church, and they were on the stairs outside, and they actually had to open up the doors so all the people in the park, well, they didn't really have a parking lot, but the field across the street from the church could hear the sermon for Dr. Alexander Dons, and one of the presenters at that funeral was Joseph E. Lee. This is can you go back to? One more. And to his right is another prominent African American, his name is Sergeant Tillman Valentine, who, when Frederick Douglass went to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and he had a call for African Americans to join the United States Colored Infantry, Tillman Valentine answered the call. His letters to his wife during the war, the most preserved letters between a soldier and his family during that time. Very few could read and write. And Tillman Valentine's letters, there's several of them are the most preserved letters from a soldier to his family. He was also the Grand Master of the Prince Hall Masons here in Jacksonville. He was one of the first people also to embrace Joseph E. Lee. And many of the buildings that burnt down in La Villa during the Great Fire of 1901, he was the contractor to build most of those buildings. Okay, good. That's John Scott Jr. again. Frederick Douglass said of him that he was one of the most educated men in the city of Jacksonville. He was introduced at Wilberforce University. Frederick Douglass was the trustee at the time, and they had a close relationship. So he was trying to raise funds for a school in Live Oak, Florida called Brown College, which later became Edward Royce. he and Josiah T. Walls were raising money and getting money from Frederick Douglass to help support that school. This is the proceedings of the Most Worshipful Union Grand Lodge in 1886, and one of the people in there, long before Hyman Reynolds and long before Robert Smalls and Josiah T. Walls, was a man by the name of J. Willis Maynard, who's actually the first African American ever elected to Congress, but Congress refused to seat him, and he moved to Jacksonville, Florida, and became a prominent printer while he was here. Don't remember that picture. That was not for me, is it? It's Knight Templars.
It's the Knight Templars here in Jacksonville.
And that's the picture I was telling you about with the first African Americans that served the legislature. And if you see, right in the middle was Josiah T. Walls. He was actually respected the most by his fellow congressmen and senators. Joseph E. Lee specific certificate from the A.M.E. Church when he converted.
It was in 1884. He was made an elder.
Go back a couple sentences.
Go back a couple, you said?
Right there.
Right there? Okay.
So as you just heard from Dr. So the Masonic Order has a lot of rich history. Backing up to 1873 when Joseph Lee moved to Jacksonville, he immediately met members of the Masonic Order, and they kind of took him under his wing, and they saw a lot of promise in him. And in 1873, the same year he graduated, the same year he moved to Jacksonville, he was admitted to the Florida bar, becoming the first black person with the law degree to be admitted to the Florida bar. He was also the first lawyer, the first black lawyer in Jacksonville to practice, as well as the first lawyer in all of Florida, black lawyer with a law degree. 2 years after moving to Jacksonville, he was admitted to the Florida House of Representatives, where he was re-elected twice, so he served a total of 3 terms over 6 years. And then in 1881, he even served on the Florida Senate.
Pull your microphone a little closer, Sean. I want to make sure people can hear you. Keep going.
This was
That's yours?
Yes.
Good. Go for it.
So here's another interesting fact about Joseph E. Lee. In 1887, he was appointed municipal judge. The problem was he didn't live within the city limits of Jacksonville. And so, of course, he had opposition. And so Joseph E. Lee gathers a company of people. It's a logging company, and they lift his house physically on a carriage drawn by horses, and they move his house a few hundred feet right into the Jacksonville city limits. So guess what? I'm now a resident of Jacksonville, so guess what? I am a municipal judge.
Duncan Fletcher, by the way, was the person who challenged the election. It was an election in which he defeated two white candidates back in 1888, Judge.
And then, and here is a newspaper article about Joseph E. Lee that's a sketch of what he looked like at the time, where they're describing the fact that he had been, that he had qualified for the courts of the state of Florida. And he was a judge of Jacksonville. Now, that's fine. Even though Joseph E. Lee had all these achievements and exciting things happening around him, his family life was just wrought with tragedy. He was married to his wife, Rosa, and some of the articles that we saw described her as a lady from the city of Tallahassee. They got married in 1874. And unfortunately, Joseph E. Lee's, all his children predeceased him. The picture that you see in front of you is a story about, I think Judge Davis had alluded to it earlier. There was an exposition back in 1888, 87, 88. And what was happening at that time was Florida was a huge tourist attraction. However, California was really giving Florida a challenge. And so the state of Florida built this exposition that they call the Subtropical Exposition. It was said to be over around 100 feet above Main Street, and it had what they described as an electrically fitted fountain, and it also had some ponds with rare fish, and it had art galleries, and it had products. It displayed products about the state of Florida, and those are pictures of the structure. And Joseph E. Lee was one of the speakers at this exposition, which was a big deal at the time because the President Grover Cleveland and his wife visited the exposition, and I believe one other president spoke also at that opening. Don't remember the name of the president that spoke at that opening, but Joseph E. Lee was so big that for something like this, he was chosen to be one of the speakers. And that's a picture of our guy.
And I'd like to pick up from right here. In 1888, he was elected judge, like Missy had said. This made him the first black judge in the entire South. Just let that set in for a second. And then, in 1890, he was appointed by President Ben Harrison to be the collector of customs at the Port of St. John's. This is very important because the Port of St. John's imposed duties, and those were a great source of revenue for the city. And he made sure that the products that were coming into the Port of St. John's were, were regulated. That's what he did as a collector of customs. And here's a photo of the Port of St. John's around the time that he would have been the collector of customs.
There was no income tax in that time. No, I say that to say that the position was critically important because this was the source of funding for the government. And for him to have had that position was a very powerful and important and influential position.
Correct. And he was reappointed by Grover Cleveland to that same position and William McKinley to that same position. In 1898, McKinley decided to appoint Joseph E. Lee as the collector of internal revenue. And in 1901, he was reappointed as collector of internal revenue by President Theodore Roosevelt. And here's a newspaper in 1897 showing that he was appointed again to be the collector of customs. And he actually had a very close relationship with President Roosevelt, which Sean will get into.
Okay, so if you can go back.
Go back? Okay.
So he was very close to several U.S. presidents. William McKinley was the first. When McKinley was running for his Republican nomination, the then Kingmaker Mark Hannon came to Joseph Lee in Jacksonville, where Joseph Lee assured him that he had the full support of the Florida Republicans. So he had so much influence that he could speak for all the Florida Republicans to tell them we're going to support your candidacy. And it was instrumental in McKinley winning the nomination and consequently the presidency. After that meeting, all Joseph Lee asked for was access to the White House. So he got a president elected almost, and all he asked for was a platform to better do his job. As well as Theodore Roosevelt, he had a close connection with him. In 1901, I believe, Theodore Roosevelt was touring the South. And when he came to Jacksonville, he made an unplanned visit to Joseph Lee's home. So the President of the United States came to his house. While there, they talked for a while, and Roosevelt asked him to attend a meeting in St. Augustine. In that meeting at St. Augustine, Joseph Lee was the only black person.
In the top right corner, that is a bond that was paid to Joseph E. Lee. You can see in it says Joseph E. Lee, Collector of Internal Revenue for the District of Florida. And this is really important because this is not only evidence to show that he was the Collector of Internal Revenue, but it shows us the types of bonds that folks would pay him while he was in that position. And in the bottom right, we have a newspaper article just mentioning Joseph E. Lee. And here's a really interesting story. And it's the largest newspaper on this page. It says, "Joe Lee seems to be boss." And this was an article that went into the discontent of white Floridians that did not like the appointment of Joseph E. Lee to the office that he was duly appointed to. They complained. They wanted him replaced with a white collector of internal revenue. So the president did review his appointments, and he made some changes, but he kept Joseph E. Lee. He said, "I was thoroughly satisfied with the way things are going," and he likes the advice that Judge Lee has given him. And Judge Lee is the boss, and what he says goes. And these are other photos showing that he was a prominent Republican leader within Duval County. He was the chairman for the Duval County Republican Executive Committee for more than 40 years, I think about 40 years. And whenever there was a meeting in the city within the Republican Party, Joseph Lee, Judge Lee was always in control, as said in this Nick's newspaper that's going to be shown.
And I just want to add there that he was the president of the Duval County, Florida Republicans, and he was the secretary of the Florida Republican Party for 40 years.
I added this from a case that involved jury selection and the exclusion of jurors in a case originated here in Jacksonville. And John Ballou is an attorney who offered evidence. The case involved a man who had been, Bonaparte was his name. He had been convicted of embezzlement, but he challenged the jury selection because it did not include any African Americans at all. And at that time, jurors were selected by the sheriff just going out and grabbing people and bringing them in to serve on jury. They go out on the street and pick people up and tell them they're going to serve. And there had been no African Americans picked up. So Bonaparte challenged the selection of the jury as being violative of the need to have African Americans represented in jury selection. And to prove that there were African Americans qualified to serve on juries, because the sheriff had said, "I couldn't find any." This testimony was given, and this is from an affidavit that was provided by John Ballou in the actual case. I lifted the language from the case. "My name is John H. Ballou. I reside in the city of Jacksonville, Duval, Florida. I'm a lawyer by profession, an African-American lawyer, if I didn't add that. And I've practiced in the courts of the state of Florida since 1881. I have been present at the sessions of the court held in Duval County, Florida since I came to the state, with the exception of for a short time when I was absent from the county. My association with the colored people enables me to state that the colored people of the city and county have furnished themselves several schools and colleges in addition to public schools. They have about 6 or 8 private schools and 2 colleges supported by themselves and about a half dozen public schools. These schools are well attended by colored children and have been ever since I came to the state. The colored people have quite a number of churches in the city and county and own considerable valuable property in the city and beautiful church buildings. These churches are well attended. They also have a number of fraternal orders. The Masons own a piece of property on the corner of Duval and Broad. The lot alone is worth $50,000, and they have, of course, construction at a cost of $100,000. They have property on Florida Avenue worth about $40,000. The Oddfellows own considerable property here, and we have other fraternal societies owning considerable property. The colored people have accumulated a great deal of property here. Some are large property owners. Quite 1/2 of the property owned here is owned by colored people. That is, there are more colored people owning their own homes than there are white. At the same time, the whites have more valuable holdings, although there are colored men who pay taxes on property from $50,000 to $150,000. I know these facts from personal examination and investigation. The colored population of this county is large, and according to the last census, there are more colored people in the county than white. I know that there are 1,000 colored men of sound judgment, discretion, and fully qualified for jury duty. I have attended the courts of this county and this court since 1881, and that I know that no colored men have served on the jury in this court for the last 10 to 15 years or in any of the courts of the county. So that was a description of Jacksonville I had never heard before. And it was the community in which Joseph E. Lee was practicing law.
Yeah. So in 1905, J. Douglas Wetmore did an analysis of ownership in the city of Jacksonville, and African American community owned 51% of the wealth in Jacksonville as late as 1905. This was a study he did for the Negro Business League, and he also presented it to the Niagara Movement, which was the predecessor to the NAACP. I recommend everybody in here, there's a book called An Army of Lions, The Early History of the Civil Rights Movement. I suggest everyone get a copy of this book. The Civil Rights Movement, you can put right here in Jacksonville, Florida, at its earliest formation, and the blueprint that Dr. Martin Luther King used 70 to 80 years later was started by people like Joseph E. Lee. When the Memphis sanitation strike took place, it took Martin Luther King 3 months before he put his name on it. Martin Luther King never would have been caught up in the Tawana Browley situation like Al Sharpton did. One of the things that Martin Luther King valued was his name, right? So before he would put his name on anything, he would do a complete analysis, his due diligence, before he would get involved. That's the way Joseph E. Lee was. So at his time, Joseph E. Lee was often called a sellout and so forth because he wouldn't come and just at this drop of a hat put his name or defend something without thoroughly investigating it. And then secondly, during the Great Migration, he stood up and tried to get the white business owners in Florida to give higher wages to the African American community, to give them other benefits to keep them from moving to the inner city. And at that time, Judge Lee took a hit in African American newspapers because of doing such, but he was actually right because people were giving up home ownership and land that they owned to sell this land to go on a promise up to the north. And let's face it, the truth was people didn't have home ownership in New York City and Boston and Chicago, St. Louis, where the Great Migration took place. People were forced to live in ghettos, they were forced to live in certain areas, and there were not enough jobs to support everyone that fled the South. So Joseph E. Lee actually turned out to be right, that it was better to try to get concessions from all these business owners and shipping companies here in Jacksonville and try to get better wages so people would have stayed, and they would have stayed homeowners and so forth. So that was one of the things about Joseph E. Lee that was like in his time, he faced a lot of opposition, but every time if you look 100 years later, he was always on the right side of history.
Let me, we're about to impose on your time because I know we're supposed to conclude at 8 o'clock. And we've got really much more to offer. This is an announcement from Joseph E. Lee at the end of his Internal Revenue Service, saying that he's going back into private practice. He had a wonderful and extensive practice. But, and if you can think of the timing of this, I put these two slides in to signal what was the beginning of Jim Crow, or the time that became most prominent in our nation. The top photograph is from, it's a still photograph from the movie The Birth of a Nation. And it depicts the African American legislators as buffoons. You see, we've got Fido Bass eating on the floor of the legislative chamber. If you were able to look at the entire movie, it would show drunkenness and other negative stereotypes. The whole thrust of the movie was derogatory and demeaning, and as it relates to African American men primarily, they were depicted as barbaric, violent rapists, essentially. And what I want to mention about this movie is that it was, I believe, as influential as the internet has been on our current culture. It was like, I think Woodrow Wilson described it, he screened it in the White House, by the way. It's lightning on the screen. It was a phenomenal, cultural event that set the mindset, among other things. I mean, this is just the most glaring example of the kinds of things and mentality and attitudes that existed in the country at the time that set the stage for the Jim Crow period to follow up until, some would argue up until today, that the attitudes engendered by this kind of mass media is still at play. We probably should stop. I mean, because I know we've got another half an hour at least of material that we could present. And let me see. Let me rush through the slides we got for you. The W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington were at odds about what the African American community should consist of. These were the kinds of issues that Joseph E. Lee was dealing with. Look at them. Some of them are still extant, if you will. Lynchings, reapportionment. Does that sound familiar? The interesting thing I found out about Joseph E. Lee is that I was not the first person to become interested in him. You can see that our community had the sufficient interest to create a memorial for him, a monument. It's lost now. No one knows where it was. There was a museum established by Joseph E. Lee, by a lawyer, Ike Williams, who used to be a publisher here in the city. And he collected materials from members of the community, and that got some traction. There was a museum created. Urban renewal resulted in the building being raised, the materials being lost. At least I thought they were lost. We actually, I think, may have discovered some of them in the archives of the Florida State Archives, thanks to, and I forgot to remind a couple of people, Suzanne Judas is here tonight. She's with she's the community outreach officer for the United States courts. She made a trip to Tallahassee because none of us could, and actually dug into the archives and pull up some of the materials that you see tonight. The librarian for the 11th Circuit Court, also Kelly Delvin, she did some work. The museum was operative for a while. Some of the materials have been lost. The interest spanned about a decade, but then was lost. And this will conclude this morning. This will be near the last thing. I think we'll take, if you allow us, just one more minute to talk about this. Go ahead, Ian.
So I want to let you guys know, in the year 1920, March 25th, Joseph E. Lee passed away in his office, and the entire community grieved. They wrote kind words for him, and eulogies, poems. And in our research, we had the lucky opportunity to hold letters that were written by W.E.B. Du Bois. If you don't know who he is, he was the producer of the Crisis magazine, which was very influential amongst African Americans at the time. And we had this letter. Within the letter was this parchment. And it is from W.E.B. Du Bois to the widowed wife of Rosa B. Lee, which says, "My dear madam, I want very much for reproduction in the Crisis magazine a picture of the late Joseph Lee and some account of his life. I hope you can favor us. I will be careful to return the picture if you wish." And the widowed wife of Judge Lee was able to produce this photo. This is a genuine photo of Judge Lee. The pins on his chest are from the Republican National Convention when he supported William Taft. He was a very distinguished gentleman, and you can tell by the way that he dressed. You can see just how he carries himself in that photo. Very confident.
Let me just close by saying we have so much yet to learn one of the reasons I was excited about making this presentation was to engender the curiosity that I caught in the historians of the community, the people who value history, with their hope that you'll help us with the research. All of us have now the tools to do it from home sometime, but we may not have the time or the inclination. So I hope that the Jacksonville Historical Society will begin to consider doing this more often. In closing, just let me say how important it is, because of the chilling effect of legislation that is about to descend upon our community about telling the truth and telling histories completely. It could be that the Jacksonville Historical Society will be one of, and organizations like it, private organizations, may be the only vehicle and conduit for knowledge to be shared openly and honestly. So please, I would hope that with the research and presentations and work that you do, that you would ask in each instance, how was the African American community involved and how were they impacted, and what was their contribution to any issue. My experience has been that that thread runs through arguably a quarter of the population experiences everything that we all study. But that quarter of the population is very seldom given the attention and the study that it needs in order for us to be fully informed as to what the circumstances and conditions were at the time. So thank you very much.
Judge Davis speaks well and accurately. The Jacksonville Historical Society exists to be a conduit, and this evening's presentation is a model for the inspiration that people take from the resources in archives such as ours at the JHS. The archives at our organization are literally, and I do mean literally bursting with inspirational stories and information about Jacksonville's past. And one of the things that is the most exciting about being a historian is discovery and being animated and inspired by the things that you learn as you're pouring through the resources, the manuscripts. My colleague David Jameson knows about this. There's nothing as satisfying as reading the old mail, right? And discovering stories about people that you never knew. And what we've seen here this evening is an example of how that storytelling, that discovery, can really set fire to our imagination, our comprehension, and our desire sometimes to look back through the telescope into the past and get a better idea of the stories that we stand on and the people whose shoulders really have supported the city that is now ours in the present moment. The JHS is here to be a resource for that, and so we appreciate the opportunity. And man, it's been a joy working with Judge Davis and his students and Attorney Ehrlich and Jerry Urso on all of these stories. We look forward to more. And this is a great presentation, a great format, and a great way to accompany scholars of history on a voyage of their inquiry and discovery. So we're grateful for that. If there are any questions for the panelists, I'd be happy to take a few moments if the panelists are willing to entertain some questions. Are there any? And if there, yes?
You said that Judge Lee went into the legislature in the 1870s. Was he the first black legislator in the House in Florida?
No, he wasn't.
No.
Well, I can't tell you who was.
John Scott Sr.
Was he?
Yeah, John Scott Sr. was the first to serve the legislature, and the first senator was also from the villa. His name was Thomas Warren Long, who was a veteran of the United States Government. I'm sorry. Thomas Warren Long was the first senator, I believe.
Yes, ma'am.
It's not completely clear to me why he
The question for those who may not be able to hear is, why did Joseph E. Lee come from Philadelphia to Jacksonville?
What I remember learning was it Perman?
It was Perman.
Perman apparently formed a relationship with him and Perman was a public speaker at the time. And the only thing that I recall is that the references made a note of a speech that inspired Joseph E. Lee that was made by Perman. And the title of the speech, I remember because it was a little unusual, was Land of Flowers. And so I don't know in what context the speech was made, but the only reference that I recall about Reese, because I was like, why did he come to Jacksonville? And actually Jonathan Gibbs, who was one of the, what was his relationship, Jared?
He was also Mason and FAMU.
He was here in Florida.
Yes.
Somehow he had a relationship with Jonathan Gibbs. So he had two strong relationships, probably made, if I had to speculate, and this would be interesting, probably made in D.C. and at Howard, because that was the epicenter of intellectual activity and connections at the time.
You know, many of us learn to recruit in the winter in the north to get good people to come down to the south. I think I would do it myself. Maybe that reference flowers, it was snowing up there, 80 degrees down here, and they thought that was a great idea.
Well, the third snowbird recruiting is not a new idea.
So the exploits of the 3rd United States Colored Infantry when they took Jacksonville was actually what caused Abraham Lincoln to have a massive recruitment of African Americans because they held the city in the deep South. And then after the war, many of these African Americans that served in the 3rd Colored Infantry stayed in Jacksonville, and word got out that this was the place to be.
Dr. Crooks.
When I first came to Jacksonville 50 years ago, I met Ike Williams, who you mentioned very briefly, Judge. And he was one of his lifetime goals was to collect everything he could about Joseph E. Lee. And do we know anything about what he all collected? His wife was still alive a couple of years ago. I don't know if she still is now.
You know, I made some efforts.
We have a nodding head over
I made some efforts to try to make contact and didn't have any success. And one of the things I learned in digging through the Historical Society's materials was that Ike Williams actually took interviews, recorded interviews of people who knew Joseph E. Lee. And then among the collection that he had garnered were those tapes. And that got me excited. So I looked everywhere I could and made, as many inquiries as I could to try to locate those materials. Because a lot of them, I'm not sure that the museum materials have all been collected. I think they were salvaged. And they may be in Tallahassee, some of them may be in Tallahassee. Suzanne Judas told me that there was one more box that she had, 3 more boxes that she had not had a chance to look at in Tallahassee. So I'm hoping when we open those that they'll, when we get a chance to get there, that we'll find out.
Because he's worth a book. He's worth a biography that someone should write and publish as one of the heroes of Jacksonville.
I agree.
He's worth a book, Dr. Crooks says, and Dr. Crooks would know about that. Yeah, take this as a call to researchers to keep your radar turned on and tuned in and on the lookout for other resources. Dr. DeFore.
Judge, I would just commend to you a parallel story of Judge James Dean at the exact other end of A1A, who was in Key West, who was elected in the same year and was removed from office the next year by Governor Fleming from Jacksonville, and was subsequently posthumously returned both to the bar and to the bench.
I don't think everybody can quite hear you, including me.
Try it again. There's a parallel story from the other.
Yeah, there's a microphone, sorry.
Preacher with the microphone. There'll be a collection. Just kidding. There's a parallel story that might be of interest to you. Judge James Dean in Key West at the other end of A1A was elected in the same year in 1888 and was removed by Governor Fleming from Jacksonville about a year later and was posthumously posthumously restored to office and to the bar by Governor Bush, actually, by a group of people that worked on it. And it's interesting. I'll get you some information.
Good. I'd like to learn more about it. You know, you reminded me, we did mention, you may be familiar with the National Bar Association. It's the counterpart of the American Bar Association, which was established because African Americans couldn't join the American Bar Association. But Joseph E. Lee was one of its founders. I discovered that, and I hadn't realized that. He's from Jacksonville.
He was vice president.
Yeah, he's vice president of the original organization.
Yes, ma'am. Maybe you could use the microphone just over your right shoulder, please.
Good afternoon, good evening. I have a question about the people that came before Judge Lee. You know, the person that's appointed or elected always makes history, but what about the people that wanted to become judges? Do you have any record of them, the ones that failed or were stymied?
I could not find anything in our research materials, and that would have to be a whole different search to see if there were other individuals at the time who wanted to be a judge, wanted to be a House representative, or wanted to be a senator, and they just couldn't make it. So maybe they were erased from history, perhaps on purpose, too.
You know, one of the challenges we have, the Times Union wasn't covering much of what we told you all. No, seriously. They just were not. There was a deliberate media block out of what was happening in the African American community. There would be reports of events here in Jacksonville involving the African American community, in Pittsburgh, and in northern cities that had African American publications, but there was not a steady source of news about that. So I mention this because our research has been stymied by that fact that the records just could not keep. I failed to mention, I went to the courthouse to try to find Judge Lee's orders. I wanted to put my hands on them and hold them and read them, and then the fire of 1901 destroyed most of the city's courthouse records. I've heard a story of some of them that have, in particular around property, that were salvaged by, and I just learned this story. Someone, and I forget who told me that, 2 black men took boxes of records from the courthouse and to a barge on the city, and then nobody knows who those black men were, but one of the clerks of the court had enlisted them to help as the fire was bearing down on the courthouse, and they were able to save some records, but most of them, including Joseph E. Lee's, got destroyed in the fire.
And here's another thing, the research that these students and the other 3 that joined them did with Judge Davis, there's so much more that we're still working on. And so we already have a new set of students who will be working with Judge Davis on where this research that Ethan and Sean and the rest of the group who graduated last year, they will be taking it from there with Judge Davis. And one of them is present today, one of the students. Stand up.
Give a round of applause. I never say her name right, so that's one of the students.
Some of the best sources is the Evening Metropolis, which is scanned and available at the public library. That's where I've done a lot of research, and the A.M.E. church's records have been well preserved, so like a lot of those pictures and actual words spoken by Dr. Lee, I was able to ascertain through the Christian Recorder Archives and the proceedings of the Most Worshipful Union Grand Lodge, which after the Great Fire, all lives were lost, but I took a trip to all places, Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and they have some of the best record of African American secret societies being held in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, especially like the proceedings of the A.M.E. Church, the proceedings of the Prince Hall Masons, and so forth. So we was able to put together a lot of stuff with Joseph E. Lee in his own words.
Yeah, you know, we didn't delve into his ministry He was an ordained minister in the African American Episcopal Church. He actually, I think he served as a pastor of Mount Zion A.M.E. Church, which is still here. And we did not make contact with the historians of that church to see what they might tell us about his ministry. But in reading about him, it's particularly in some of the later years as he was transitioning out of his public service, there was much made of the fact that he was a man of strong faith, and apparently a very good preacher, because there were comments made about some of his sermons and how powerful they were.
Almost every church has a archive, whether it's known by that name formally or not. It may be as modest as a file cabinet with one drawer devoted to papers of previous leadership meetings, letters, correspondence, bulletins. But think about the rich evidence of the past that can be uncovered in just about any church. Some churches are very serious about preserving and maintaining and sustaining and adding to the records of their past. One of the most impressive here in Jacksonville that I'm aware of is Bethel Baptist Institutional Church. They have had a devoted archivist for many years, lamentably just passed, Ms. Camilla Thompson. But that archive continues, and the church that you may belong to or that you have family members associated with, be alert to that as a resource for combing out the evidence of the past. You know, the past is what happened. History is how we understand and explain the past, and that's why we're constantly revising, improving, sharpening, focusing, adding to history. That's why it's so fortunate that there are students such as these and their successor who will be joining this research project on Joseph E. Lee. We continue to add to the history of figures like that.